Hi guys, I'm back, and this time we're going to talk about water pollution. So let me share my screen again. And this is more content from the Principles of Environmental Science in Chapter 11. So we already talked about water resources, kind of the quantity of how much water there is. And that is the content in the first part of the chapter, and this is the content from the second part of the chapter about water quality and different kinds of pollutants. So let's get started. Okay, so pollution, we already mentioned in the context of water pollution, can kind of come in two forms. And that is that we can have what's called point source pollution, where we can identify a very specific location that the pollutant is emanating from as it gets into the environment. And these are like something that we can physically point to. They're easier to monitor and they're easier to clean up because we know exactly where they are. And this would be something like a sewer outflow or some sort of factory effluent coming from some sort of manufacturing or energy facility. And so we definitely have pollutants that get into the environment, both the air and the water, that are this type. But then we also have lots of what are called non-point source pollutants, which are pollutants that come from a much more diffuse source, where we have large areas of landscape that are all each emitting a little bit of pollutant. And these are much more difficult to monitor and to clean up because they're not coming from a particular pipe that we can cap or a particular like effluent point that we can kind of put a stop to. So this would be something like large factory farms or any kind of farm, or golf courses that might have lots of different kinds of fertilizers kind of washing off lawns. So a lot of water pollutants come in both types, and it's just kind of important to understand that we might need different approaches to try to clean up pollutants that are coming from these different types. So this is not a class about policy, but just to give you a little context, like we have a Clean Air Act, we also have a Clean Water Act that was passed with a lot of environmental legislation in the early 1970s. The Clean Water Act is passed in 1972, and the goal, according to the Clean Water Act of the United States, is that all waters should be, or all navigable waters, I should say, waters that we could take a boat down, should be fishable and swimmable. So we want the water to be clean enough that you would be comfortable eating out of the water and physically putting your skin inside the water and swimming around. And we certainly are not at a point where I would say the waters in our country are navigable and waterable, and swimmable, or sorry, fishable and swimmable, but that's our goal. And so the Clean Water Act also developed a national pollution discharge elimination system, which basically gives permits for people to pollute for certain point source pollutant types. And so we monitor and we regulate what kinds of pollutants are coming into the environment. We know that it's inevitable that we're going to have some sort of pollutants coming out, but we want to make sure that there's not too much, and we want to make sure what is coming out. So there's a national pollution discharge elimination permit system for that. And then for the other kinds of non-point pollution sources, they're harder to regulate at their source. And so instead, we've developed a system where we have different water bodies that we have identified as being contaminated. So we could go to like Lake Davis, or we could go to Lake Tahoe, or we could go to the Feather River, and then we could test the quality of the water and determine if it seems to be contaminated with lead or with nitrates or some other pollutant that we're concerned about. And then we can go upstream and we can identify that there is a total maximum daily load of allowable contaminant that we're going to allow and consider reasonable to be getting into this stream. And then we're going to work with land users and land owners and land managers upstream to try to minimize that daily load of contaminant that's getting in, to try to keep the water body having minimal impairment. So that's what we do for the non-point source pollution. And then in addition, we also have a Safe Water Drinking Act that was passed a couple years later in 1974. And this sets maximum contaminant loads, are called MCLs, for water that we're going to drink. So the water that we're going to drink, of course, we hold to a higher standard than the water that's out in the environment. And we want to make sure that we're not getting sick. And so we have kind of a lower amount of contaminants that we think is allowable for that water. And of course, we have a lot of systems where our water might be treated before we drink it to try to remove different kinds of contaminants that might be in the water. And unfortunately, we have many areas certainly in the world, definitely in our country, and definitely in California as well, where people in communities are not being served water that meets these maximum or that is, up to par according to the Safe Water Drinking Act, that exceeds maximum contaminant levels. So this is kind of against federal law, but unfortunately, often these are kind of communities that are low-income areas. There's a lot of migrant labor communities in the Central Valley exposed to a lot of agricultural pollutants that really struggle to have access to safe drinking water. And so this is something that we still have a lot of concern about today, even in places like California. Okay, so how can we test the water in the environment or the water that we're going to drink to determine if it's safe or meeting kind of acceptable contaminant levels? Well, first of all, we can actually go out and just take physical or chemical properties of the water. We can measure how hot it is. We can measure the pH of the water, the acidity of the water. We could measure how much nitrate is in the water. And so a lot of that kind of chemical and physical testing is certainly done in water bodies. But in addition, there's another system of testing that's called biological monitoring. And in this case, what we do is instead of looking at the chemical properties or the physical properties of water, we look at the organisms that are living in the water. And since organisms have to live in the water, not just at one moment in time where you might be taking a water sample to test pH, for example, we figure that whether certain animals are able to live in the water or not gives us a better kind of long-term idea of the quality of water. And certain organisms we know are quite sensitive to different kinds of contaminants. And so if there's ever issues with water contamination, we know those organisms will die out and we will not see them in biological monitoring samples. Whereas other organisms are much more able to live in polluted water. Think about things like mosquitoes or water skeeters. These things are able to live in water that is quite hot, that has low oxygen, maybe that has high nitrates and other things. And so by looking at the diversity of organisms that are living in the water, we can get an idea of kind of a longer term water quality picture. And so one interesting way that we do this is we test something that's called the EPT ratio. So there's three particular types of organisms that are called Ephemeroptera, Plycoptera, and Trichoptera. So those are basically like mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies. And we know that those are particularly sensitive organisms. So we can go out and collect a sample of what are called macroinvertebrates in the water. So those are basically like insects, things that are not microscopic that we can actually see, but they're invertebrates. We're not necessarily capturing fish or like frogs to do this. And then we would look at what percentage of those organisms are of these three sensitive orders of insects. And then the higher the percentage of these sensitive organisms that we find there, we consider that the quality of the water is better. So this is an important kind of biological monitoring tool that's used in a lot of waterways. And this would not necessarily be something that would determine if water is safe to drink, but this would be kind of more of an environmental, is this a fishable and swimmable, good quality water? This would be a good way for us to be able to judge that. Okay, so now that we kind of understand the framework, I want to talk about some different types of pollutants, and these are the types of pollutants that are, one, monitored according to the Clean Water Act and also discussed in the textbook. And so we'll go through some different types and talk about some kind of concerns associated with them. So the first group are pathogens. So a pathogen is basically just means something that can make you sick. So this could be a bacteria, often is a bacteria, but could be some other kind of organism in the water that makes you sick as well. So many diseases result from kind of impurity in water. And again, a lot of times this is bacteria that's in the water. So diseases that you've likely heard of, things like cholera or dysentery or giardia or kind of E. coli poisoning, these are all associated with bacteria that get into the water and then people drink without realizing when they're drinking unclean water. And so these usually come from other humans. So like if you had somebody that was like pooping near a water source, or some sort of, somebody who is sick, who is then allowing their germs to get into the water source, could pass through the water, this bacteria from one human to another. And so having proper sanitation methods is a really important way to try to limit the spread of these different kinds of diseases. So making sure that when you're drinking water, that water has been treated and that water has been tested, that water is safe, is something that, again, hopefully most of us in the United States have access to, although unfortunately we are finding that that's not necessarily true. But certainly in the US, we do a better job of this than many other developing countries that really struggle to provide their citizens with kind of sanitized water. So this is one type of water pollutant that you could come in contact with. Okay, another type of pollutant are metals that get in water. And so we talked about both mercury and lead in the context of air pollution, because these can also get into the air as well. And both mercury and lead and other metals are highly persistent once they get into aquatic systems. And so they can come from things like mines, mine drainage, or they can come through the air through like burning of coal. Both lead and mercury could be kind of an impurity in the coal that could end up in the air and that could fall out and end up in the water in these aquatic systems. And we see two different phenomenon, bioaccumulation and biomagnification, that occur with these types of metals. And these ideas are somewhat related, but bioaccumulation is the idea that there's the selection and absorption and storage of a great variety of molecules by an individual organism. So basically, to translate that, that would mean within an organism's lifetime, the longer that organism lives and eats other things in its environment that might have mercury or lead in them, it's going to kind of store those contaminants in its body. And the longer it lives, kind of the more contaminant it might have in its body. So it accumulates these contaminants that it can't really process or get rid of throughout its lifetime. That's bioaccumulation. And then biomagnification is the idea that as we go up the food chain, organisms at the top of the food chain that are eating organisms that have eaten many other organisms, that have eaten many other organisms, that have eaten many other organisms, are basically accumulating not only over their own lifetime a certain kind of contaminant, but they are accumulating a contaminant that was in all the things ate below it. So it is kind of funneling and concentrating an enormous amount of contaminant load in its body. And so you can see this picture on the bottom kind of showing how we might have a small kind of aquatic plankton type organism have a very small concentration of mercury, and then little insects that eat it might have a slightly higher concentration of mercury because they're eating lots of little plankton that have each a little bit of mercury in them. And then a small fish that eats lots of insects over its lifetime might have an even higher concentration. And then a bigger fish, and then a shorebird or an aquatic bird, and then a human might really have a very high exposure because of this biomagnification process. And so we also mentioned this in the context of air pollution, but this is why many, especially bigger and longer lived fish, can be dangerous for humans to eat, or especially eat in large quantities. And especially this is true of humans or of like women that are pregnant or breastfeeding. And so again, you might see signs like this around popular fishing areas where it would recommend against eating certain kinds of like striped bass, and especially it would recommend against eating the largest striped bass, which have had the longest amount of time to accumulate or metals, contaminants, and then of course have eaten much more food over their longer lifetime than a smaller, younger organism, and so as a result are likely to be much more toxic. And this is true of fish in our local waterways, and also true of fish out in the ocean. Things like tuna are kind of infamous, or swordfish are infamous for having large amounts of contaminant in them. So it's unsustainable to eat those fish anyway, but another reason to kind of avoid them is because of their potential metal contaminant load. Okay, next, salts. So a lot of times people think of salt as sodium chloride, the kind of table salt that we use in cooking in our food. And that is only one type of a big group of compounds that are called salts. Salts are just basically anything that happens when an acid and a metal react with each other. So salts can be sodium chloride, but they could also contain other things like arsenic or selenium that could be real toxins to organisms in the environment. And a lot of times these come from geology in an area, so rocks that break down to form minerals and soils. And over time, as water washes through these soils, it might concentrate different kinds of salts in certain areas, and especially as we kind of manipulate the drainage of areas and channelize water through areas, we can be kind of concentrating these different kinds of contaminants that may be somewhat natural in the environment in areas and create bigger problems, like in artificial reservoirs or things like that, where the water might be quite contaminated and then could create real issues for organisms that are living in and drinking that water. So these are both images of the birds and fish that come from an area called the Kesterson Reservoir that's kind of in Central California. And they had some major selenium poisoning issues in this reservoir that resulted from, again, natural geologic selenium deposits, but the kind of man-made infrastructure, water drainage and reservoir infrastructure kind of exposed organisms to this poisoning, selenium poisoning, in a way that wouldn't have occurred in the natural environment. And then, of course, we also add salts to our environment, especially in the snowy season, to try to reduce ice. And when we do this, we can add sodium chloride to the environment, which can be also bad in high quantities, and then is also quite toxic for many plants. So as it persists in the environment, we can create environmental problems that way. So salts are another thing to look out for in our water. Unfortunately, the formatting on this got a little weird, so just bear with me. I'll change this around on the PowerPoint slides. But as I just mentioned, salts are something that are really difficult for plants to deal with. When there's a lot of salt in the soil, that salt prevents the plant from being able to suck water in to the plant root. And so we have a lot of salinization problems, which is like a salt addition problem in particularly arid environments where we have a lot of evaporation of water off the surface. And in particular, this is something that happens where we pump lots of groundwater, and the groundwater is water that's been sitting under the ground for a long period of time, been in contact with rocks and minerals, and may be saltier. They have dissolved salts in the water more than like surface water or rainwater. We pump that water up from the ground, then we spread it out on the surface, usually for agricultural purposes. And water in these hot environments and dry environments evaporates right away quickly, but then the salt gets left behind. And so over many years of pumping groundwater and then irrigating in these arid areas, we can have a lot of salt built up on the surface, and it can really limit the ability of these areas to persist as effective agricultural landscapes. And so you can see all this kind of white dust on the surface is this big buildup of soil that's kind of essentially making this area inadequate to be able to continue to grow food. Okay, another type of pollutant are acids. So acids, things that have a low pH. And one of the more common acids that we see is sulfuric acid. in the environment. And this is often associated with acid mine drainage, and where we have different kinds of historic mining or current mining practices that are kind of leaching exposed veins of different kinds of minerals into a waterway in a way that wouldn't be necessarily natural. We can have a buildup of different kinds of sulfur metal compounds that can kind of interact with water and create sulfuric acid. So a lot of times when this happens, we see this kind of yellowish or kind of orangish color in the water. That's pyrite, iron, and sulfur compound. That's what we're seeing that's giving it this yellow color, but it's an indication that all this kind of metal, sulfur compounds and sulfuric acid is present in the environment. And so when we have very acidic conditions in the water, this is obviously not safe for lots of organisms, especially something like fish, but even many different kinds of other like macroinvertebrates, different kinds of insects that live in the water might be killed by the exposure to these acids. So again, acid mining and mine drainage is kind of one of the main ways that this might get into the environment, but also these compounds can get into the environment from the air through coal burning, leather tanning, leather smelting, petroleum production. So contaminants can get into the air, sulfur can get into the air, and then it can combine with rainwater and come down into the water and create acid pollution that way. Okay, moving on, chugging through. Another and really important type of pollution is called eutrophication. And eutrophication is basically when we have an overabundance of nutrients in our environment. And nutrients, we know, are things that are required for growth. So at first, this might sound good when we would want a lot of nutrients in the water to support the growth of organisms and fish. But unfortunately, what happens is when we pump too many nutrients kind of in an unnatural quantity into the water too quickly, we create what's called cultural eutrophication. So there can be situations where over time, water bodies kind of fill in and extra nutrients create more ingrowth of plants, and we have kind of a natural succession process where like a pond would turn into a meadow. And again, it's when this becomes accelerated by human use, and we call it cultural eutrophication, that we have a lot of concern about this. And this usually happens when nitrates or phosphates, so nitrogen, oxygen compounds, or phosphorus and oxygen compounds that might be in fertilizers or different kinds of detergents and cleaning products get into our waterways. And they are required for plants to grow. And when plants get these extra nutrients, the algae in the water will start to grow very rapidly. So we get what's called an algae bloom. And this can be undesirable for a variety of reasons. So the first one is that as the algae starts to grow, there's usually kind of a complementary bacterial bloom that goes along with the algae bloom. So as the algae are growing more and more bacteria start to grow in the water. And those bacteria, in some cases, can themselves just be toxic. So certain like cyanobacteria and stuff have kind of toxic compounds associated with them that can make the water poisonous. But then one of the main concerns is that this microbial bloom that goes along with the bacterial bloom uses up all the oxygen in the system. So all these bacteria are using oxygen to break down the algae, and they're using up the oxygen at a very rapid rate that might be otherwise used by fish and macroinvertebrates. And there's just a lot less oxygen in an aquatic system than in the air, right? So it seems like from our perspective, breathing in air would be hard to use up all the oxygen around us. But in the water, this can happen actually quite quickly and then can lead to death of many organisms like fish. And then once the fish die, then even more bacteria are going to start to break down the fish. So they're going to be using up even more water. And this is another kind of positive feedback system that we talked about earlier that can start to spin out of control and create what are called dead zones, where we have big areas of water in lakes or along mouths of rivers This happens in the Gulf of Mexico almost every summer, where big drops in oxygen start to kill off lots and lots of organisms. So again, this is something that happens in the Gulf of Mexico, kind of off the shore of Texas and Louisiana almost every summer. And hypoxia is the specific kind of technical term for the water that is hypo, low, in oxia, oxygen, so really low in oxygen. So hypoxia is defined as the reduction of O2 or oxygen levels to an extent that's detrimental to aerobic organisms, those organisms that need oxygen to survive, which is most organisms. So most fish will die once we get down to levels of oxygen in the water that's like 2 milligrams of oxygen per liter. But some organisms like trout and salmon are much more sensitive, so they usually die once we have levels dropping below 5 milligrams per liter. And then this diagram showing the Gulf of Mexico is showing the areas in red. So orange is dropping below 2, and then the red is kind of dropping below 1 milligram per liter, and then yellow is dropping below 5. So you can see there's this pretty big area where we have lots of different kinds of fish and other organisms dying off, and then washing up on beaches. So this not only has impacts to the environment, but of course then has impacts to recreation and tourism, and all different kinds of economic systems for people that are along these coastlines. So obviously this is something that's very undesirable and is accelerated because of an increase in nitrogen and phosphorus that's getting washed into the Gulf of Mexico because of upstream lawns and washing and factory farms and all this kinds of things that's getting kind of all these nutrients that are getting washed into the water and creating this eutrophication problem. Okay, so along with this comes this concept of biological oxygen demand, or BOD. So a couple kind of abbreviations that you might see are DO, which refers to the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water. And oxygen is added to the water from the air. And the more there's mixing between the air and the water, the more oxygen there's going to be. So like if there's waves or churning water, that's going to help get more oxygen into the water. On the other hand, oxygen is removed from the water when organisms are respiring or using it up. So any living organ, or most all living organisms in the water, are taking oxygen out of the water to break down their different kinds of sugars to create energy. And that's true of things like fish. It's also true of things like plants. They photosynthesize but also respire. And then it's also true of different kinds of microbes that are decomposing other things like algae or dead fish in the water. So all those processes are using up oxygen. And a biological oxygen demand is the amount of water that's used by the organisms. Okay, so usually there's an inverse relationship where as the biological oxygen demand increases, as organisms are using more and more oxygen, then the amount of oxygen, the DO, drops down. So we kind of see these shifts back and forth where these different metrics in the water, the DO and the BOD, are kind of crisscrossing each other and going back and forth. So this, we might see this if there was some sort of point of waste discharge or effluent, maybe from like a sewer treatment plant that's getting into the water, or like there's a golf course along a river and it's washing a bunch of extra nutrients into the water. And at that point, we would see that all of a sudden the biological oxygen demand would go up as a lot more organisms are starting to grow and respond to the extra nutrients. So the biological oxygen demand, and you can see this in the image here, will spike as a result of the eutrophication here. And as that happens, then the dissolved oxygen starts to crash in the water. And eventually it goes down so much that a lot of organisms are killed off, that eventually the biological oxygen demand is going to have to come back down, because now there's just not that many organisms using oxygen in the water anymore. And sort of as that happens, eventually the dissolved oxygen can come back up, but in the process, it can create some really unfortunate consequences kind of in that localized region. So anyway, it talks about this in your book a little bit, and that's what we would expect to see. Okay, more pollutant types. So the next one we're going to mention are sediments. So sediments are just small pieces of in many cases, natural material like soil that's getting into the water. And so we usually measure the amount of sediment in the water by measuring the water's turbidity. The turbidity basically refers to like how clear the water is. If you can see through it, it's not turbid and it doesn't have a lot of sediment. Or if it's high turbidity or very turbid, it's really cloudy and you can't see through it very well because of all the sediment. And so we can introduce sediment to the water through different kinds of like plowing and tilling and exposing agricultural landscapes to wind and water without any cover on them. And then we also get a lot of sediment just from roads. So all kind of like the dust that comes off roads as roads break down and as people have dirt on their tires and drive on the roads. That is another source of a lot of sediment. And this is undesirable in aquatic systems for a couple of reasons. One is that it limits light penetration into the water. So many organisms that live in the water depend on having access to the light. And when the light goes away, that can be problems, especially for certain kinds of algae or organisms that depend on light as a way to navigate. And then another problem is that as sediments get into the water, they embed the maybe bigger like rocks or cobbles that might form the bed of the river. And this basically prevents oxygen from getting down into some of these crevices. So it kind of destroys the habitats for certain kinds of macroinvertebrates or insects that might be living in the water. But also it can create problems for fish. So many fish create redds, or they like burrow down in between the cobbles to lay their eggs, and then their eggs kind of hatch, and then they come up and they depend on kind of having loose aerated cobbles to be able to do this. But a lot of the sediment getting in and around cobbles can kind of cement the sediments together and again prevent oxygen from getting down in there, and can make it very difficult for fish to lay eggs and for the fish eggs to be able to hatch and survive. So this is considered to be an undesirable thing as well. So you can kind of see on the right a more natural setting, and on the left a more cemented or embedded cobble situation. And of course, some aquatic systems are sandy and are silt-based and mud-based naturally, but for those systems, particularly kind of upstream or mountain river systems that have naturally cobbles existing, this is where the extra sediments could start to be really problematic. Okay, another kind of pollution that you might not think a lot about is thermal pollution. So this is when the water gets too warm, and usually because of something that humans are doing that's unnatural. So maybe we're trapping water behind a dam and creating a big shallow reservoir. We're exposing water to sunlight for a longer period. That could create thermal pollution. Or we might be pulling in water from a river system to cool some sort of power plant or other run water through some other kind of manufacturing outfit. And we might, through that process, not necessarily be adding chemical contaminants to the water. So when we're done with the cooling, we might dump the water back into the river and think that it doesn't have any contamination since we haven't added chemicals to it. But changing the temperature of the water changes kind of the habitat that organisms in that stream might be living in. And in particular, there's an important relationship between oxygen and temperature. So warm water does not dissolve oxygen as readily as cold water does. Cold water can hold more oxygen. So we talked about DO, dissolved oxygen levels, a couple slides ago in the context of eutrophication. And now we know that when water is warmer, that warm water can hold much less oxygen. So the graph on the left is showing this relationship between temperature and DO, okay? So the warmer the water, the less dissolved oxygen there is. 5 degrees can hold as much as like 10 milligrams per liter, whereas 30 degrees Celsius water can only hold 2, so that's a big difference. Anyway, all these problems with hypoxia and dead zones are going to be really exaggerated when the water is warm. So we usually see the problems that we talked about in the case in the Gulf of Mexico in the late summer. That's when we have kind of peak hypoxia and dead zone issues. And so if we're artificially thermally polluting water by kind of rerouting water into some sort of, and using it as some sort of coolant, or trapping it in a shallow, warm reservoir kind of environment during the summer, we can be really exaggerating the risk of this kind of hypoxia problem. So thermal pollution can be a concern as well. Okay, one of the last things I want to mention is pharmaceuticals. So this is kind of an pollutant that we're more recently becoming aware of in the last couple decades. And so we know that humans take a lot of drugs, you know, prescribed drugs, other non-prescribed drugs as well. We take a lot of antibiotics, we take a lot of hormones, birth control, steroids, and we pee these out. Once we take them, they get into our biological systems. And after we pee, the pee goes into the sewer, it goes into the sewer treatment plant, and they treat for certain kinds of things there, but not pharmaceuticals. And then they put that water back out into the environment and into rivers, and it goes downstream to the next community of people that are gonna drink it, and they're gonna drink your pee and your steroids and your hormones and your antibiotics. But not just people, lots of other organisms are getting exposed to all these kinds of pharmaceuticals that are really not ever being filtered out of the water system. And so this is one particular study I'm showing you that was done in France. And in this case, this was done around a pharmaceutical factory, so a very high pulse of pharmaceutical waste that was getting pumped into the water. And in this case, what they were noticing is that the sex ratio of fish was changing as a result of the exposure to these different pharmaceutical waste products. So fish and some amphibians can actually change their sex over their lifetime. So it's not quite as an extreme of something as like a human transitioning to a different sex. That takes a little bit more work. This is a little bit more of a fluid thing for fish, but certainly it's very notable that we're seeing above the factory and then downstream of the factory a big transition away from female and male exclusive fish to intersex fish, which are basically fish that have both anatomically male and anatomically female sex organs. So anyway, we are aware that this kind of exposure could be impacting lots of fish and amphibians, which are very sensitive to kinds of things being absorbed through their skin. And there's a lot of interest in trying to learn about how this might be impacting aquatic organisms as they're exposed to more and more accumulated pharmaceutical material in our waterways over time. And then, of course, we're also interested in how this might be affecting human health as well. Okay, so far I've talked a lot about just kind of general pollutants, and a lot of these are pollutants that might get into surface water that's moving around in our lakes and rivers. Groundwater is, of course, another important source of water. About 50% of Americans and 95% of rural Americans depend on groundwater as their water source. And overall, groundwater has historically and still today is much, much less regulated, both in how we have access to the quantity of groundwater, but also kind of quality of groundwater is much less regulated than surface water. And one of the reasons for that is just much more difficult to access and get at, all testing, wells that individual people have on individual properties. But there's certain kinds of contaminants that can be of particular concern in groundwater. So especially communities that are pumping groundwater as drinking water for kind of a broader community use will definitely be testing for these. And these would be things like nitrates that are getting into the water, especially like over dairies or confined animal feeding operations where we have lots of animals pooping and peeing in kind of a confined area. And then they might have big waste ponds of all the animal waste that's sitting out, trying to prevent it from getting into the surface water, while those contaminants might be leaching down into the groundwater when that's happening. Pesticides that are being widely spread out across the landscape can leach into groundwater. MTBE is a gasoline additive, especially around gas stations. We see a lot of this leaching into groundwater, and this has health concerns. And then we're going to talk about fracking or hydraulic fracturing a little bit next week when we talk about energy. But the process of hydraulic fracturing releases many kinds of chemicals into the groundwater. And this kind of chemical cocktail is proprietary to companies. So actually the public is quite unaware of what some of these contaminants are, which is one of the issues. But one thing is that the fracking is attempting to get methane out of the ground. And so we know for sure that as it is succeeding in breaking rock to access natural gas reserves, and that natural gas is bubbling up into pipes that are collected for methane use and storage and sale, there's certainly methane that's getting into local groundwater reserves. And then people have measured this widely, coming up into like local and residential well systems. And methane is something that is not something you want to drink, can create real health problems. So these are kind of some of the main pollutants that we're interested in looking at in the context of groundwater. Okay, just in the interest of time, we don't have a lot of time to talk about water pollution in terms of the oceans, but obviously the oceans are vast and there's a lot of people creating a lot of pollution, and a lot of this pollution is getting into the oceans. And one of the issues that we have with oceans is that there's kind of limited responsibility. So it's kind of a little bit of a Wild West in terms of regulation, international regulation and international control. And so once water gets out into the ocean, there's not like a particular country, once the garbage is like 3 miles away from the shore of most countries, then it's not really their responsibility, their problem, quote unquote, anymore. And so this is probably one of the reasons that these big patches of garbage out in the ocean have gotten so big and gone so unchecked. So you may have heard of things like the Big Pacific Garbage Patch, and there's actually not just one garbage patch, there's several different garbage patches that have been collected as a result of kind of water currents moving material around and concentrating them in certain areas of the ocean. And when you think about a garbage patch, you might think about a lot of like visibly clear trash, like the picture that I have in the top. And certainly there is a lot of that material floating around in the ocean. But a lot of the garbage is kind of small, broken down microplastics. So like fibers from your fleece that you wash in your washing machine, or you wash at the laundromat, and then the little tiny fibers go into the wastewater treatment plant. They're not filtered out. They go back out into the river, and they end up in the ocean, or microplastic beads, or just kind of plastics that have broken down, plastic bags and other plastic material that have broken down through like photochemical processes, through exposure to the sun and UV light. And all these tiny, tiny plastics are out circulating around in the ocean, and they're being ingested by organisms, and then they're accumulating up the food chain, and they're creating some real health hazard issues, certainly in the aquatic food chain, but also then ultimately in the human food chain, since we eat a lot of aquatic organisms. So this is something that we've had a lot more awareness and concern about in the last decade, and hopefully something that we're going to be working to address. I know some of you are writing research papers about this, so I look forward to reading them. Oh, I forgot to put this in here. So this is interesting. What do we do with all this trash? Well, I was looking at this. In 2015, Adidas started making some sneakers that were exclusively made from some of this marine debris. So that's maybe one thing. We can try to take it out of the ocean and then repurpose it into some other things that we need. Okay, so the last topic that I want to address is water treatment. We usually go on a field trip to the water treatment plant in Quincy, and unfortunately we're not going to be able to do that this spring. But as I mentioned, we kind of regulate water in two ways. We regulate water in the environment, and then we regulate water that we're going to drink. So before we determine that water is safe to drink, we test MCLs, maximum allowable contaminant loads of different kinds of contaminants, like metals, like pathogens, like E. coli or coliform bacteria, like nitrates, to determine if the water has low enough levels of those things to be able to drink. And each water treatment district has to publish all the records of those things every year. And so actually for a lab, I'll have you guys look that up and see what you can find. But then there's also a system of treating water before we determine it's clean enough to be released back to the environment after we've used it. So after it's gone down our drain, gone down our shower, gone down our toilet, unless we live in a rural area where we might be on a septic system, and the septic system is hopefully cleaning out bacteria, and then a leach field is allowing the water to go back into the soil and hopefully continue to be cleaned by soil bacteria before it eventually gets into a stream or river. In more concentrated areas, we send our water to wastewater treatment plants, where they have a variety of different treatment processes. So first of all, they go through what's called the primary treatment process, which is basically just like separating out large solids like poop or other things that might get into the toilet out from the water. So that's kind of a primary treatment process, literally just like a separating out of like large chunks from the water. And then they go through what's called a secondary treatment process, where they use bacteria or UV ultraviolet light, chlorine or ozone to clean the water. And then hopefully by that point, they have low enough coliform bacteria counts and low enough nitrate counts and stuff that the water would be considered safe to release back into the environment. And then in some cases, this is not true in places like Quincy and in most places, but in some places, they're starting to add a tertiary, kind of a third level of treatment, where they're actually working to remove some things like metals or acids, or we talked about like pharmaceuticals aren't really being treated yet. But if we were continuing to improve our water treatment process, we would be looking to those other metals, acids, salts, pharmaceutical level cleaning. But that's very, very expensive. And so that's not something that's widely done or really done almost anywhere at this stage. Also, there's a whole system of storm water. So when it rains on your street, the drains on the street get water off the street so it's not flooding. And then usually those storm drains go straight into creeks and rivers and lakes. They're not treated, although sometimes that storm water does make it into water treatment plants and it is treated there, but usually it's not. And so when there's a lot of times signs by these things that say like, don't pour contaminants into the storm drain, it's gonna end up in your waterways. And if you're like dumping gas or paint or anything like this down your drain at all, especially in a storm drain, it's essentially the same thing as like dumping it right in the creek. And so it's gonna contaminate and kill organisms when you do that. Okay, so as much issue as we have with treating our water here, developing countries struggle even more with this, as we've discussed before in the context of human population. About 2.5 billion of the 7.5 or so billion people that we have on the planet don't have access to the proper amount of water just for basic sanitation, for clean water, uses for drinking, for cleaning, for cooking. And about 2/3 of global childhood mortality is related to different kinds of waterborne diseases. So here's pictures of Mumbai in India and Sierra Leone. And we can see that there's unfortunately a lot of connection between impoverished communities and water moving through these communities in close proximity to lots of people. And this improper sanitation that's happening here is something that's leading to a really, really kind of unacceptable rate of human health suffering in childhood, as well as adult mortality. So as we want to kind of work to lift people up out of poverty, this is one of the major things that we need to work on as a global society. Okay, so what can you do to improve water quality around you? Well, you can try not to pollute the water. So you can get rid of your batteries, your motor oil, and your electronics in the proper way. You can bring them to the dump, and they have like e-waste. They collect batteries, they collect oil on certain days, and make sure that those are being disposed of in a proper way. For the most part, they take those items for free because they want people to be disposing of them properly. And so don't be lazy and dump them down the drain or dump them outside in your yard. Please bring them to the proper place. If you wouldn't want to drink it, don't dump it in the storm drain, because either you are going to literally end up drinking it, as it's going to get into your well or get in somebody else's well, or somebody downstream is going to be drinking it. And so consider, if you wouldn't want to drink it, don't dump it down the drain. Try to use biodegradable home cleaning products like phosphate-free soaps and laundry detergents. This can improve or limit eutrophication. And then also try to minimize fertilizer use, pesticide use, herbicide use in your yard, and support food production systems that do this as well, to try to limit the contamination that's getting in your water. So those are some kind of actionable things that you can work on to improve the water pollution picture. All right, that's all I have to share for today.